I want to tell you something about the specific mercy of a warm meal when you are not expecting one. Not the food itself, the fact of it. The fact that someone thought of you before you were standing there hungry, that the thought came first and the meal followed, and by the time it reached you, someone had already decided you were worth the time it took. I did not know how much I needed that until a woman I had never spoken to started leaving it outside my door at 6 in the evening, every single night for 31 days. I counted them. I had time, that month. I had very little else. Her name was Penelope. I know that sounds like the beginning of a different story. It was the beginning of mine. My name is Cal Briggs. I was 35, a physical therapist at a sports rehabilitation clinic in Portland, Maine, and I had spent the better part of my career helping people rebuild what they had lost. Range of motion, strength, the particular confidence that comes from trusting your body again after it has failed you in some significant way. I was good at it. I understood, professionally, the patience required to restore something that had been damaged. I was considerably less patient with myself. The job was the right shape for what I was carrying, which I did not fully understand until later. Rehabilitation is not about returning to what you were. It is about finding the new range, the thing you can do now, which may be different from what you could do before, but is yours, and is real, and is enough. I had been telling patients that for 8 years. I had not yet applied it to myself. My mother had died 14 months before this story starts. Not suddenly. That is a thing people say when they mean it was a long illness, as if the length of it is supposed to make the end easier, and it does not. It only means you grieve the same person twice, once slowly and once all at once. She had been sick for 2 years, and I had spent those 2 years driving the 3 hours between Portland and the house in Concord where I had grown up, every weekend, without exception, because she was there and I was her son, and there was no version of the math that worked out differently. I do not say that to be admirable. I say it because it is what happened, and because when it ended I had nothing left to drive toward, and I had not yet figured out what to do with that. After she died I moved. Not for a reason, not a job transfer or a life plan. I moved because the apartment I had lived in for 6 years had her in it in ways I did not know how to inventory. The mug she had given me, the blanket that had been hers before I borrowed it and never returned it, the particular smell of the hallway that I associated, without choosing to, with arriving home to call her. I could not subtract those things. I moved instead. I found the apartment on a Saturday in January. 3rd floor, an older building near the eastern promenade, with windows that faced north, and got the gray winter light that suited my mood, and a radiator that clanked at predictable intervals that I came to find companionable. I was not unhappy there. I was not anything in particular. I was present in the way of someone who has finished something enormous and not yet found the next thing to be present for. That was the condition I was in when the first meal appeared. January 14th, a Tuesday. I came home from a 12-hour shift, a long one, a patient in post-surgical recovery who had needed more time and I had not been able to leave, and found a covered dish outside my door. Ceramic, dark blue, with a folded piece of paper underneath it that said, in handwriting that was small and very neat, from 3C, "Hope it's still warm." That was all. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The dish was warm. It smelled of something with garlic and rosemary and something deeper underneath, the kind of smell that belongs to food that has been tended carefully rather than assembled quickly. I brought it inside. I ate it standing at my kitchen counter because I had not yet owned the apartment long enough to have a routine that involved sitting down. It was the best thing I had eaten in months. Not because it was elaborate, it was a simple braise, chicken and root vegetables, but because it was warm and it was there, and someone had made it and left it for me, without knowing anything about my day, except that I lived next door. I told myself I would knock and thank her the next evening. I did not knock. I told myself I would knock the evening after that. I did not knock. What I did, instead, was find myself listening, the following evenings, for the particular sound of a door opening and closing in the hallway. I learned the sounds of the 3rd floor over those first weeks without meaning to. The way 3A's door stuck slightly at the bottom and required a small lift before it closed flush. The sound of the elevator, a deliberate, slightly effortful sound, like a machine that has been asked to do something it is proud of. and the sound of 3C's door, which opened quietly and closed quietly, which told me something about the person inside before I knew anything else about her. The second meal came the following Thursday. Soup this time, a lentil something, with bread wrapped in a clean dish towel beside it. The note said, "From 3C. The bread is better warm, but it travels all right." The third, the following Monday, pasta with a sauce that had been made from scratch, which I knew because jar sauce does not smell like that, and I had been cooking professionally adjacent long enough to know the difference. I ate every one of them. I did not knock. Not because I was ungrateful, because I had the specific fear of someone who has found an unexpected warmth and is terrified that acknowledging it will end it. The meals were the only thing in my apartment that felt like someone knew I was there. I was not ready to risk that by introducing myself to the reality of what it was. That was the pattern I was in. Not the grief, exactly. The after-grief. The specific stillness of a person who has been running very hard towards something for a long time and has arrived at a place where there is nothing left to run toward and does not yet know how to exist at a pace that is not urgency. She was leaving meals outside my door, and I was eating them alone, and the month was passing, and neither of us had said a word. By the third week I had formed a picture of 3C from the meals alone, the way you might assemble a person from their letters without having met them. She cooked from scratch. She paid attention to what she made, not showing off, but investing, which is a different thing. She used whole spices that she had ground herself, I suspected, because the intensity was wrong for pre-ground. The portions she left were exactly right for one person, which meant she had been estimating, and the estimate was accurate, which meant she had been paying some quality of attention to me before I had been paying any to her. That last observation I set down carefully and did not examine further. The meals had a rhythm I had started to look forward to in the way you look forward to things that have become reliable in a life that has recently lost most of its reliability. 6 o'clock. The sound of her door. The particular ceramic weight of the dish on the floor outside mine. I had worked out that she was doing this between finishing her own day's work and making her own dinner, which meant she was making two things where she could have made one. I thought about that more than was probably warranted. I thought about it during patient sessions, in the quiet parts where the work was physical and the mind could idle. My patients were rebuilding things, knees, shoulders, the trust between intention and movement. I was eating someone else's food and calling it getting by. The comparison was uncomfortable enough that I continued not to examine it. On the 23rd day, the note changed. Instead of the usual brief line she had written, "I've been leaving these without asking if you have any dietary restrictions. I should have asked sooner. If anything doesn't work for you, please leave a note and I'll adjust." I stood in the hallway and read that note 3 times. She had been worrying about whether the food worked for me. For 23 days she had been leaving meals and wondering, without knowing, whether I could even eat them. That level of quiet consideration, the thought that came after the thought, the care taken about the care taken, did something to me that I did not entirely have words for. I wrote back that night. Left a note on her door, in my own handwriting, which is not as neat as hers. Everything has been perfect. No restrictions. Thank you doesn't cover it, but it's what I have. In the morning the note was gone. That evening, the meal had a small addition. A square of dark chocolate, wrapped in paper, set beside the dish. No note. Just the chocolate. That got me. I am not going to pretend it didn't. I knocked on day 31. A Saturday evening in February, when the light was going early the way it does on the Maine coast in winter, leaving the sky a particular blue-gray that looks like something between dusk and absence. I had been home since 3. The meal had arrived at 6. It always arrived at 6, which told me she had a schedule, and that I was in it. I stood in my apartment for 40 minutes after I heard her door close. Then I picked up the empty dish from the previous night, which I had washed and was going to leave outside her door as I always did, and I walked down the hall and I knocked. She opened the door. Her name was Penelope Marsh. I know because I read it on a package outside her door once, in the 3rd week, and did not acknowledge to myself that I had registered it. She was 32, I learned later. She had dark hair that was slightly damp at the edges, as though she had just washed it, and she was wearing a sweater that had clearly been washed many more times than was strictly advisable, and she was holding a wooden spoon, which she appeared to have forgotten was in her hand. She looked at me, and she turned red. Not pink, red. A full, honest, involuntary red, starting at her collar and moving upward, the kind that arrives before a person has any opportunity to do anything about it, and which, in my clinical experience, is the body's most reliable truth-teller. She said hi, I said hi, I held up the dish. I wanted to return this in person, and to say thank you in person. I should have knocked sooner. I don't have a good reason why I didn't. She looked at the dish, then at me. The red was beginning to settle, slightly, but her expression was doing something I couldn't fully read. A specific kind of collected attention, like a person who has just been asked a question they had been thinking about for a long time and is deciding how to answer it. "You don't have to explain," she said. "I think I do," I said. "You left 31 meals outside my door without asking anything about it, and I ate every single one of them and didn't knock. I'm not usually like that." She leaned against the door frame, the wooden spoon still in her hand. "I know," she said. I looked at her. "You know?" "I could hear you," she said. "The walls are thin. Not in a bad way, just, I could tell you were home. I could tell when you came in. I could tell when you hadn't eaten, which is—" She stopped. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't," I said. She held the door frame. "I didn't do it because I thought you needed it," she said. Silence. "I did it because I wanted to. There's a difference." I stood in the hallway of the third floor of that old building on the Eastern Promenade and held the blue ceramic dish and looked at a woman I had been listening to for a month without ever seeing her face, and something inside me that had been running on empty for a very long time registered that it had just been handed something real. I said, "Would you like to come have dinner with me?" "Not. I don't have anything. I can't cook like that. But there's a place 2 blocks from here that I've been meaning to try since January, and haven't gone to because I've been eating very well at home." There it was. She looked at me for a moment. Then she put the wooden spoon on the counter just inside her door. She took her coat from the hook beside it. She stepped into the hallway. "You should have knocked sooner," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just, next time, knock sooner." She said it like there was already a next time in mind. The place 2 blocks away was a Portuguese restaurant that had been there since the 70s and decorated accordingly, with tiled walls and pendant lights in amber glass and menus that were laminated and did not apologize for it. We stayed for 3 hours. The food was excellent, and neither of us ate very much of it, which happens sometimes when a meal is the least interesting thing at the table. She was a landscape photographer. She spent several months a year doing contracted work. National parks, travel publications, the kind of long-form visual journalism that requires you to stay in a place long enough to understand it before you photograph it. She had been in Portland since October, in 3C, while she worked on a project about the Maine coastline in winter. She was there until April, maybe May, depending on the light. She said that last part, depending on the light, with the particular equanimity of a person who has learned to live inside uncertainty rather than against it. Like a woman who had spent enough time outdoors in changing conditions to understand that the light you plan for is never the light you get, and the light you get, if you're paying attention, is usually better. "That sounds like rehabilitation," I said. She looked at me. "What I do," I said. "You plan for the recovery you expect, and then the actual recovery is different, and if you're paying attention, the actual one is usually not better, but realer, more specific to the person." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to put it." "I've been trying to apply it to myself," I said, "with limited success." She looked at her water glass, then at me. "What happened?" I told her. "Not everything. It was a first dinner. But the shape of it, the 2 years, the driving, the afterward." She listened the way she looked at things, I suspected, with full attention, not waiting for her turn, not filing it away for later, just present inside the hearing of it. When I finished, she said, "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you," I said. "I started leaving the food in the 2nd week," she said. "I heard you come home late one night and there was nothing. I could tell there was nothing in there. The sounds were wrong, too quiet." I looked at her. "You could tell I hadn't eaten from the sounds." "I told you. The walls are thin. You've been paying attention for a while," I said. She picked up her glass, set it down. "Yes," she said. "Not an apology, just a fact, stated plainly. by a person who had decided to be honest about it. That was the moment I understood that the 31 meals had never been charity. They had never been obligation, or neighborly duty, or anything that could be filed under ordinary kindness and left there. They had been attention, specific, daily, quietly given attention, the kind that notices when someone hasn't eaten, that adjusts the portions to exactly right, that adds a square of chocolate when a thank you note arrives and has no other way to answer it. She had been paying attention to me since before I knew she existed. And I had been eating her food alone in my kitchen every night and calling it warmth, when it had been something more than warmth the whole time. We walked home from the restaurant that night, on the same block we had both been walking separately for a month. At her door she turned and said goodnight with the particular quietness of someone who is not sure what the right amount of words is and has decided to err toward fewer. I said goodnight. She went inside. I went inside. I stood in my kitchen for a while. The radiator was doing its clanking. The apartment was the same as it had been every other night except that I was aware of it differently, aware of the wall between us, aware that she was on the other side of it, aware that I was standing in a place that had felt like an end point for 4 months, and had started, somewhere during a 3-hour dinner in a tiled room with amber lights, to feel like a beginning. The complication, when it came from inside me rather than outside either of us, which in my experience is always the more difficult kind. 3 days after dinner she knocked on my door, the first time she had ever knocked, which I registered with a specific quality of attention, and asked whether I wanted to see her work, the coastline photographs, spread on her floor the way she organized them when she was editing. I said yes. I went over. The photographs were extraordinary, not in the way that makes you want to describe them, but in the way that makes you go quiet inside them for a while. But I left after an hour, made a reason. And I spent the next 2 days being more careful than the situation required, because something in me had activated the old calculation, the one I had been running since Teresa, maybe before, about what it meant to want something and what it cost when you said so. I was a man who had just come through 14 months of grief and uprooting and rebuilding from the most basic level. I was not sure I trusted my own judgment about whether what I was feeling was real or just the first warmth available. I did not want to be someone who reached toward a woman because she had been kind to him when he was empty. That was the more honest version of the fear. It took me 2 days to find it. On the 3rd day I walked down the hall and knocked on her door and said, "I left too fast the other night. I'd like to come back and see the rest of the photographs, if you'll have me." She opened the door wider. "I left the good ones for last," she said, not because she hadn't noticed, because she had waited. Then June. The project on the coastline expanded, which she said with the straight face of a professional who is aware that the project expanding has nothing to do with the coastline. We spent the Maine winter and spring the way people spend time when they have both found the thing that was missing and are not in any hurry to rush it, slowly, with full attention, in a place that was cold outside and warm enough inside. She showed me her photographs. I told her about the patients, the ones who surprised me, the ones who taught me something about patience that I had been failing to apply to myself. We ate at the Portuguese place 8 more times, and eventually the owner stopped giving us menus, which is a recognition that means more than most. She also, at some point in March, quietly resumed leaving food. Not every night, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always at 6, always warm. I started leaving food back. I am not a skilled cook. She was diplomatic about this in a way I appreciated. We did not discuss the arrangement formally, we just fell into it, the same way we had fallen into everything, without announcing it, because some things work best when they are simply done rather than decided. My colleague at the clinic, a woman named Dara who had known me for 5 years and had watched me go through the previous 14 months without saying anything except what was useful, stopped me in the hallway in April and said, "You look different." "Different how?" I said. "Present," she said. "You look present." I thought about that on the walk home. 8 blocks, the route I had memorized in January, past the bakery and the ironwork fence and the harbor view that appeared briefly between 2 buildings on Congress Street if you were walking at the right angle. I had been walking this route for 4 months. I had not until recently been seeing it, not because it had changed, because I had. In March she showed me the photograph she had taken from her window in the 2nd week of January, the night she had first started thinking about leaving food. It was a photograph of the hallway outside our doors. Empty, amber lit from the fixture overhead, the blue ceramic dish sitting outside 3A where I had delivered it by mistake that first night before I realized my error. Long shadows. The specific quality of light in a corridor late at night when everyone has gone to bed. I didn't know it was going to matter, she said. I just saw it and thought, someone's home and they're alone and the hallway looks like that. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The hallway I had walked through every night for a month without seeing what it looked like. You're good at seeing things, I said. Sometimes you have to be outside something to see it clearly, she said. I thought about that, not because it was a profound observation, because it was specific and true, and because the woman who said it had been outside my door for 31 evenings in a row, seeing clearly, before I was ready to open it. I am glad she waited. I am glad she kept leaving the food. I am glad the walls were thin and her attention was real, and that when I finally knocked she went red in the way that honest people go red, without choosing to, without being able to help it, all at once. That red was the first thing I fully trusted in 14 months. Have you ever had someone take care of you quietly, without asking anything back, and realized later that the care was telling you something you hadn't been ready to hear? And have you ever been the person who waited, who kept showing up in whatever way you could, for someone who wasn't quite ready yet? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.